Thank you very much. It's okay with the sound? Oh, okay. It's a little strange time for for conference. I'm not used to it. A little bit late at night, but it's okay. I'm glad to be here, and I will start. Thank you for the opportunity to address on this conference and to share some of my thoughts about difference between comics and cinematic or film storytelling. How you mentioned, my area of research is philosophy of comic book art, but the media of film and the media of comic book art are connected to the point of their assumed ontological identification. So I think that there is an essential need to highlight the similarities and to highlight the differences of those two media. And probably, I don't know if you are familiar that the first film recording of Auguste and Louis Lumière, workers leaving the Lumière factory, and the first modern comic book, The Yellow Kid by Richard Outcault, appeared in the front of the audience in the same year, in 1895. More specifically said, with other words, the film and comics are born in an identical historical moment. And that's why their suitability as a pop cultural phenomenon of the 20th century, their media similarities, as well as shared affinities towards the expression of the movement, made it possible in the theoretical and in the philosophical approach to the comics to assume their uniformity as an ontologically similar cinematic phenomenon. And exactly because of this, my focus in my research, in my latest book, is on the impact that knowledge and insights of the film philosophy approach have on the theoretical consideration of graphic literature or comic book art. That's my main methodological approach, how film philosophy influence to the theoretical consideration of graphic literature and comic book art. But let me start from the beginning. And probably all you know that at the beginning of the 20th century, the intellectual public and the art critics did not have a positive opinion either of the film or the comics. In those early periods, we have very dominant, very conventional understanding of jazz, of film, of comics, of vaudeville, of Broadway theater as a banal, immoral, aesthetically questionable phenomenon. Two very influential art critics from the United States in those periods were very influential, such Henry Louis Mencken, American essayist and cultural critics. And the second influential art critic was George G. Nathan, American drama critic and editor of the American Mercury and the American Spectator. Probably you know the most important literary magazines in those periods. And those two critics lead a very large group of public intellectuals for whom the film and comics were essentially an identically very vulgar, unesthetic phenomenon in popular culture. If you read McCain article, very interesting, I recommend you, on Hollywood and Valentino. He used words idiotic, irritating techniques, moronic art, and etc. But the very first significant theoretical book which rejected those derogative value proposition is a very interesting book. It's Seven Lively Arts from 1923. It was book by American writer and cultural critic Gilbert Sills. In 1924, Gilbert Sills wrote about America's two greatest artists of the early 20th century. And the first American great artist in the early 20th century for Sills was Charlie Chaplin. And the second for him was George Hermian. Probably you know, American cartoonist and American comic book artist, best known for comic strip Crazy Cat. And as you can see, comics and movies still go together. But after this, historically speaking, their paths in the direction of aesthetic legitimization and in the direction of theoretical and philosophical reflections goes in different directions. In film and movies, thanks to Hugo Munsterberg, thanks to Arenheim, thanks to Andre Bazin, the film first built its own aesthetic legitimacy. But comic book art remained to fight for its aesthetic legitimacy for a very long time, I dare to say, until maybe to the 90s of the last century. For a long time, there was no theoretical interest in comic book art, no theoretical interest in graphic literature, because I suppose very influential by two eminent scholars and their influential devaluing position of every phenomenon in mass culture. Two eminent scholars in the 50s. I think that it was a part of what Frederick Wertmann, a German-American psychiatrist, wrote, very extremely influential book in 1954, Seduction of the Innocent, and American writer, film critic, social critic, and philosopher Dwight MacDonald. Real know him for his very influential article, A Theory of Mass Culture. And we don't have here in this format, in these 15 minutes, we don't have time to go into the details, but those two authors labeled comic book art as a dangerous kitsch phenomenon, directly responsible for the rise of the crime, rise of the juvenile delinquency in the United States in the 50s. And those two authors caused anti-comic hysteria, radical campaign for prohibition of comics, ceremonial burnings, and public stigmatization. We have similar things here in former Yugoslavia, in Kragujevac. All this resulted in the famous US Senate subcommittee in 1954 hearings of comic book publisher, and almost no theoretical interest for comics. However, in the 70s, after the underground comics, after the British invasion in comics, especially after the publication of Mouse by Art Spiegelman, who comic book that received prestigious Pulitzer Prize for literature, this stigma toward the comic book art was slowly overcome. But what happens? This is my position. When the space for philosophical approach to the comic art is opened up, then a large number of theoreticians began to explain media ontology of graphic literature, begin to explain aesthetical nature of comic book art with the help of already established knowledges from philosophy and theory of the film. What I want to say, in other words, a series of theoretical studies and philosophical approach trying to define comic book art through the prism of aesthetic, of visual, of technical aspects of the film. And I call these philosophical approaches that use film as a model for understanding the media ontology of comic book art, I call these theories cinematic theories of comics. And these theories start from the interpretation that comic books or graphic novels are cinematic phenomena. Why? Because the pictorial and narrative elements in comics are structured in the framed, juxtaposed, proto-cinematic deliberate sequences. And one of the first cinematic theory of comics is from American comic book artist and theorist Will Eisner. In one of the first theoretical studies of comics entitled Comics and Sequential Art, he placed comics together with film, together with animation, and together with storyboards in the so-called category of sequential art. And however, it's here is a little bit true, because unlike painting, which petrifies motifs and creates a static image, comics and other sequential arts like film, animation, and storyboards, on the contrary, they are enabled and they make a dynamic and moving representation of sequences. They are appeared in our perception in the form of connected squares and images. In other words, sequential art represent and have a capacity to create a movement image and the time image. In other words, this approach assures us that the being, the essence of the comic book art was born when we had reification of the first pictorial attempt to express the movement. Beside of this, based on this, we can conclude that cinematic theories of comics in a certain way, this is my point now, ontologically says that the comics and films, including animated films, have an identical structural essence in pictorial attempt to represent the movement image and to represent the time image. But, this is very significant for me, but only with a small remark that in the film and in animation, this type of representation is optically fused and mingled. And in the comics, this type of representation is optically detached and fractioned. And however, I don't agree that this is the essence of comics, and I don't agree this is I call it chronotopic disunity is something that defines comics. And I try to find a different interpretation, which is apart, different from this iconography of dynamism, because for me, this cinematic theory of comics is problematic for several reasons. One of the reasons is that these cinematic theories of comics do not adequately explain the media ontology of graphic literature and aesthetic nature of comic book art. And moreover, the cinematic paradigm of defining comics does not at all legitimize comics as a separate, autonomous, and independent artistic discipline. What kind of argument I have for this? If the difference between a comic book and film is only in the optical fuse or optical detached representation of movement and time, then comic books are nothing but some sort of unfinished or imperfect films, some sort of unrealized films, semi-films without optical cohesions. In other words, comic books portray one type of Edward Muybridge, you probably remember, a chronophotography. Nothing fundamentally different from the film storyboard as a tool in film production, or as the British comic book author Alan Moore ironically points out. I will quote Alan Moore here: if we look at the comics through the prism of the film, then the most we can say about it is that comics are a movie that doesn't move. Precisely because of these problematic implications, I will try to illustrate a different approach with aesthetic of uniqueness of comics through the difference between comics and cinema. And I will finish with this. I don't have time to speak about every element, but I want to speak about time depicting and time images. Film's ontology, the essence of the film, allows us to reify the cinematic. On the other hand, the ontology of comics cannot fully represent the moving image and time image. Therefore, regardless of innovative comics and graphic strategy for depicting kinetic aspects of the motifs and themes, it is not fundamentally the art of moving image. On the contrary, comics are medium of fixed pictorial iconography, and comics owns its duration or its time image representation to the aesthetic experience, to the reception itself. What I want to say? I want to say that the comic frame is a pictorial materialization of a certain moment of the event, what we called in comic book theory encapsulation, or a kind of artistic exposure of the current state of the story as something like petrification or fixation of certain moment. But the moment or the petrified time image in one comic square or frame is not identical with other moment in other petrified time image or comic square or frame. What I mean by that? Namely, a one comic square or frame can express time t1 in assumed objective duration of a less than a second. For example, you can imagine a comic strip with a scene when sword is swinging. 1 second objective time, but also we have a t2 time t2 in assumed objective duration of maybe perhaps half an hour. With the comic square or the frame, we have a scene which is imagined or depicting a protagonist facing some kind of life dilemma. And that's why in comic book art, this is my hypothesis, the quantity of time in the sense of time image or duration is equal to its content. This means that narrative play with time or disruption of objective time is not only possible in comics, is essential. And when the comic frames are connected in the narrative line, it can be that comics is basically a dramaturgical petrification of relatively shorter and relatively longer time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, time 5, and time n, where n is time as a duration in the sense of very act of reading. But this time image in comics is a kind of Bergsonian time. More specifically, this time is not objective or expanded time, but a time that exists only as our experience during the reception of comic. At the moment of reading, comic book time begins to flow, but as our inner time, we, in our own consciousness, cognitively edit, rhythmically articulate, and temporalize according to our personal time standard. And to conclude, in the film, the extent and character of time duration is determined by the author and materialized on the tape or on the screen. But in the comics, the extent and the character of temporal duration is indicated in the comic square, but left to the temporal refinement by the reader's cognition. In the films, the measure and character of time duration is concrete and objective value. And in the comics, it is something that I try to call subjective and cognitive variable. And that's my general point that I wanted to share with you. I have a couple of more points, but I think that in this format for 50 minutes, this is a very important, this kind of approach with connection of how duration or time image are depicted in the comics and in the movie. Thanks for your attention. I think that I'm closely in 15 or 20 minutes. Thanks.